What's going on, guys? Coach Bronson here, and you're going to love today's episode. Today, I interviewed Dr. Kevin Stock, who's a dentist in the carnivore space. He's been doing carnivore for longer than I have. When I first got started, his information is a lot of what I used to decide if I even wanted to try it. He's got some really good information that I think you're going to want to hear. It's about how the carnivore diet can affect your teeth, how your teeth can affect your health, how oral hygiene matters and why. We get into a lot of things that you don't hear a lot of people talk about, but he's going to help you understand how your teeth affect your life and a whole bunch of other cool things. So take a listen. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. What's going on, everybody? It's Coach Bronson here, and today we have Dr. Kevin Stock on. Kevin Stock, you have been one of the longest people that I know of in the carnivore space. I know when I first started, I've been doing this for about 4 years, and when I first started looking at information, trying to find what is this whole thing about, some of your articles were some of the first things that ever popped up. So how long have you been doing this, and what's your background in all of this stuff?
Yeah. So I started eating only meat in 2017, and I had been obsessed with nutrition for basically my entire adult life.
Mm-hmm.
So I started eating only meat in 2017 and writing about it in 2017. And so I'm guessing that's some of the stuff that you probably originally fell on.
Yeah.
Everything from like why I was doing it to which eventually turned into a 30-day guide for other people to use. I'm like, all right, it's not necessarily as simple as just eat meat, drink water. There's some transition symptoms, things to be aware of. So I put together this little guide, and that got downloaded a lot. So I do think that's where like a lot of people originally found, some of the stuff I've been writing about, what I think is interesting is like not until probably this year did I start talking more about, I'm a dentist for those that don't know, but almost everything I've talked about and written about, nothing had to do with like oral health until more recently. People are like, hey, why aren't you talking about your teeth and oral health and how that relates to all this? So
yeah,
this year I've been talking about that a lot more just because people were interested in it. I didn't think people would be interested in that, but
oh my God. But once you realize the connection, which we'll definitely talk about more, but I know when I first, like, all I saw was this guy hanging from a bar with the 8-pack and hanging, this ripped dude saying, eat meat. And I was like, okay, I can relate to that. What's this all about? So what's your background? Like, so you've always been interested in nutrition. You've been you're a dentist. That's your career. You've been doing that for a while. Where did the fitness, bodybuilding, like, where did that all come into play?
So that's where it started. I was an overweight kid, and it was 7th grade or something like that, where I'm like, okay, I'm tired of being this overweight kid.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's 12 years old, something like that, where I'm like, I feel like I have the cognitive ability where I can at least start figuring some of this stuff out. So eating less, I started running cross country. I lost the weight, but didn't get the body I wanted. But that's where it all started.
Mm-hmm.
And I graduated high school, and the only thing I was really interested in was, like, I say health and fitness, but at that time it was really just fitness part of the equation.
Yeah.
And so, going into college, like, what am I going to major in? I'm only interested in fitness. Don't really know what kind of major that is. I was thinking maybe pre-med. So based on a recommendation from someone else, they said, take chemistry. That's
okay.
the hard science to get you, if you want to go pre-med, that'll help you get through there. So anyways, I got a degree in chemistry, also minored in biology and business. But I funneled all those sciences through, like, how do I build muscle and lose fat?
Okay.
And so I started making some real progress on my body throughout college. Long story short, I went to dental school that based on another recommendation. I was recommended not to go to medical school by a doctor friend. And I was like, dentistry sounds all right.
It's like a happy medium, right?
Exactly. Not a good way to choose a career, in my opinion. That's another topic. So I went to dental school, and that's when I started doing some physique competitions.
Okay.
Started blogging, I guess. I don't know what you call it back then, because it wasn't
blogging. Yeah, blogging. Yeah,
it wasn't really blog. This was like the early days. But I started kind of like writing about what I discovered the previous 10 years in the fitness world. And then I graduated, went from dental school, started dental sleep medicine practice, which is treating obstructive sleep apnea with oral devices.
Okay.
Yeah. So
we got some stuff to talk about there too. Okay.
So I've been in the sleep realm basically my whole dental career, but I've also done pediatric dentistry. Those are the two areas of dentistry I've been in. But where the story kind of takes a turn, I guess, with regard to carnivore, was I was happy with my body up until I was about 30 years old or so.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point, my priorities had shifted a little bit to more professional. My brain was kind of suffering. Like I was tired, relying on coffee, all these other kind of symptoms,
Right.
and just not feeling great. And so I was like, all right, I need to find the other piece of this recipe. And through prior experiments, keto, et cetera, I landed on just starting eating only meat. And that's why I wrote some of the stuff, which one of them turned into an ebook called The Health Dangers of a Plant-Based Diet. Kind of a clickbaity title, but that's what led me into carnivore. I started removing lectins and oxalates, all these basically phytotoxins that Dr. Bruce Ames wrote about. I went through deep into his research, and basically you remove lectins, oxalates, like you start only eating meat. So pretty quickly. And I started feeling great, and I was happy with body composition. I was like, man, this was the solution I was looking for all along, to get the body and the health. I had the fitness I figured that out. And it took me another probably 10 years, figure out the health part. I feel like I had the recipe now, the health and fitness.
Yeah, that parallels mine as well. And when I first realized I needed to get in shape, I started on the fitness side, and it took me 6-7 years to literally bump into carnivore. And then it was like, oh my God, it's like the heavens opened up, and quality of life, health, everything just kind of rained down on top of me once I figured it out. So that's awesome. So so I did not realize that you had a sleep apnea focus in your practice. We need to dig into that too. You just added a whole nother level of things to talk about, and sleep quality and the need for sleep and all that, how that affects things. So let's talk real quick. Let's stay on the carnivore side and the nutrition side of things. What are some of the things that you learned about how to do carnivore that you think people should know?
The one thing that in my early writings that I changed my mind on, really, there's been one thing, and that was my assumption that people were like me, and that I'm kind of a type A person. Let me just rip the Band-Aid off, dive all in. Don't slowly rip the Band-Aid. Don't tiptoe into the water. You drag out adaptation symptoms and sugar cravings. I'm like, everyone should be ripping the Band-Aid off. And I've changed my mind on that. I think there's a lot of people like that should just dive all in, do a 30, 90-day challenge. It could suck early on, but just get through it and then you're good. But I think maybe half of the other people is like, you know what? Let's just start making steps in the right direction. Let's start eating more meat. Let's get rid of some of the worst foods. And then maybe we never do full carnivore. Maybe you end up at 70% meat or 80%, but you're feeling great. You got the body, you're performing better, you're sleeping better, your libido's back, all these other things. It's like, okay. And it works in your life. I think that's the important thing that often gets left out. So that's where I changed my mind. But based on the other things that I've written about in the past, my mind hasn't changed a lot on a lot of it. I still think meat is the superfood. We need to be eating way more of that. Humans are primarily designed to be meat eaters. So I think that's kind of the one thing I changed my mind on over the last 6 years, whatever it's been.
So let's get into that. That's an interesting segue, not one that I planned on. We're designed to eat meat. We're designed to be eat meaters. How do our teeth reflect that?
Man, in a lot of different ways. So this is where I think the oral to diet connection is interesting. For example, there is one macronutrient that causes oral decay. If you eat protein and you eat fat, if that's all you eat, you're not going to get cavities. If you eat carbohydrates, you're going to get cavities. Okay, so that's one
ding,
signal,
ding.
right? There's one signal there. Interestingly, we can look through I'm fascinated with dental archaeology, anthropology. And if we look through the archaeological fossil record, we see prior to the agricultural revolution, 10, 12,000 years ago, mandibles, jaws, teeth, no decay, all 32 teeth fitting in. There's no wisdom teeth needing to be extracted, no impacted teeth, no periodontal disease. And when we see what happens with the agricultural revolution is there's a dramatic rise in cavities. We start to see some malocclusion, that's crooked teeth. But really the cavities go through the roof with the agricultural revolution. And then with the industrial revolution, we see malocclusion becoming normal. We see everyone has cavities. Like if you don't have cavities, you are in the minority.
Right.
Periodontal disease, now something like 50% of adults have periodontal disease. So we can look through dental archaeology, anthropology, diet associations, and the decline in oral health. Most people think like malocclusion is genetic. Like I got crooked teeth from mom or dad, when it's not genetic. There likely is an epigenetic component, but it's not
That's
your
what I was
DNA.
yeah, it's more of what's activated when you're, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, there's all kinds of like it in the mouth. That's why I think like I started talking more about it this year, because I like when we really think about it, the mouth is like one of the strongest proponents of carnivore diet.
Yeah.
Like some people will combat like we have smaller teeth and smaller canines, but there's certain things we have to take into account. Like humans started, cooking using tools, whereas like tools started replacing what fangs may have. Right. Fire replaced some, we've take that into account. So but that's kind of the counter arguments, like, hey,
Right.
but we are primates. So we do have 32 teeth. They're shape, size, numerous like primates. So that doesn't mean we should be eating leaves.
Right. Well, and there's a whole nother misconception too, that primates are just leaf eaters. If you've ever seen a gorilla eating a monkey, you know what I mean? Like it's they don't just eat plants, y'all.
That's true. That's true.
So yeah, okay. So let's talk about oral health in general. What is oral health, and then how does it affect other aspects of your overall health?
That's a good question. Like defining like what is oral health. A lot of times we define oral health by the absence of disease. So you don't have periodontal disease, you don't have decay, you don't have obstructive sleep apnea. You have, I was going to say, a healthy micro-oral biome. That's hard to.
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to ask about when we talk about digestion and everything. A lot of people don't realize that it starts in the mouth and the enzymes that are there and mastication and how that all works. So, okay, so you just said a bunch of things. Let's break those down. Let's talk about the biome and digestion and how digestion works and what it means to have healthy oral start to the whole process.
Yeah. So the oral biome, just like, so the biome, basically the bacteria that we have in the mouth, starts in the mouth, goes through the entire intestinal tract. And what we can reference the archaeological record. I like to think chronologically. What we can see. So what's interesting is I think you also want to talk about like dental calculus, plaque. It's harder. We talk about that. But what's interesting is teeth are like ideal fossils because they're mostly mineral. So when we look at fossil record, like dental archaeology, like that is the main fossil where we see.
Okay.
And calculus can get stuck on. That's that hard stuff. We can talk more about calculus.
Yeah.
But we find calculus in the dental record. So there's a mandible, the oldest Homo sapien mandible, basically had no cavities. It's basically 300,000 years old. No cavities, no periodontal disease, but it did have dental calculus, which I think is an interesting thing. Like you think about it, the perfectly healthy mandible by all observations dentally, but there was dental calculus. But what scientists have been able to do is sequence dental calculus throughout human history. And so we can see the oral biome bacteria prior to agriculture was X. After agriculture, Neolithic, major change in the biome. After Industrial Revolution, another major change in the biome. And the biggest changes when they sequence this dental calculus is the kind of bacteria that are predominant. So each one of these changes is associated with, each of these two major changes was associated with an increase in the karyogenic bacteria, where they became more and more dominant. So we are in a state where karyogenic, that's cavity causing bacterial strands like strep mutans, have become more and more dominant. And so we see that in the archaeological record. So but one thing is important to note is, and I think probably a lot of the listeners already know, is like the bacteria aren't bad, right? Strep mutans, S mutants, responsible for a lot of decay. Classically, a bad guy is not a bad guy unless it becomes super predominant, and you're feeding it the right substrates to produce acid and create decay. The bacteria play a very important role in the mouth. Everything from preventing decay to producing nitric oxide, which is critical in health, like systemic health. 25% of the body's systemic nitric oxide which its role in vasodilation is what's most known for.
Yep.
Which is preventing like everything from vascular health to treating erectile dysfunction. Like we need vasodilation.
Yeah.
25% is as produced in the mouth. So
wow.
So oral bacteria is really important. Basically, this is a long way of saying I don't recommend people just take an antiseptic mouthwash, trying to kill, sterilize.
Oh, that's a whole nother thing, right? Is all this stuff that's supposed to kill bacteria. You're like, you guys are destroying your biome there. Right. So I like how you said that, because it's a parallel to a lot of other things that people are afraid of. People are afraid of insulin. People are afraid of protein. People are like all of these things. It's like, guys, these are things that your body needs. It's in excess. It's when you go to extremes, that's where you get into problems. When you're throwing things out of, but your body wants to maintain a homeostasis where these things are working in concert and working together. It's when you're doing something out of balance to our biology, that's where the problem comes into play.
Yep. 100%.
So cool. All right. So the microbiome of the mouth is important. Chewing your food. Okay. How many times do you recommend people chew their food?
So chewing is, man, it's an underrated activity. I'll tell you that.
Okay.
Especially early on in life. And so chewing plays a very important role, let's just say for adults and everyone. It stimulates saliva production. Saliva, very important for providing minerals to the teeth, preventing decay. We can go down that rabbit hole if we want to. Saliva, super important. That's kind of like your teeth taking a bath, right? Throughout the day, it's keeping everything healthy.
All right.
So chewing is good for saliva production. Super important, very much underappreciated early on in life. So early on in life, the underlying reason we have malocclusion, like everyone needs braces these days, is like we talked about, there may be an epigenetic effect, but the root cause is the lack of breastfeeding and the lack of weaning onto basically meat. Because we need the nutrients in both of these things, especially the fat soluble vitamins and the protein, as well as the working of the jaw to properly stimulate the jaw to fully grow. And without that, we get narrow dental arches where there's just not enough room for the teeth to fit into. Wow. So chewing for like 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, like that early childhood, so important. And I mean, most people probably know the diet today hardly requires anyone to chew at all. Yeah. Like you can just put that slop in your mouth, swallow, you're done. And so the transition, I would say the modern day transition where we start putting babies earlier and earlier on formula bottles instead of breastfeeding, and then we wean them onto child mush, and then straight to the standard American diet is just that's changing the physical structure of their face for the rest of their lives.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow. Interesting. So it's kind of like when we say that when you use strength training, you're increasing bone density, you're applying that stress to the bone, which is actually helping the bone become stronger and bigger and thicker and everything else. It's similar to mouth. Like if you're not using your mouth properly or frequently as a child, particularly, it doesn't get a chance to develop the way that it's supposed to.
100%. That's the analogy I use. Like if you're going to grow, let's just say your bicep, you need two things really. You need the nutrition that's going to fuel that growth, but you also need the stimulus. If you just have a perfect diet and you don't have the stimulus, that muscle's not growing. If you just have the stimulus, but doesn't have the proper nutrition, it's also not going to grow. You need those two ingredients.
Fantastic. Okay. So how does having good oral hygiene, having good oral health, not having periodontal disease or whatever else, how does that affect the rest of the body? Because I know there's been some connections, and we talked right before this, that I was introduced to the idea of oral health as being a marker for cardiovascular disease. So what's the connection between brushing your teeth and preventing a heart attack?
So there's a lot. This is where things, and basically a good lesson in correlation versus causation is certain things like poor oral health is very much associated correlationally with a lot of adverse outcomes, which is not surprising. A bad diet wrecks your teeth, and guess what? A bad diet also is going to wreck your heart, right? Lead to atherosclerosis. Right. Now, there are arguments for causative issues where like the nidus of infection starts in the mouth and then spreads. And a good example of this is like even classic trained, not holistic dentist, whatever. If someone has a history of endocarditis, for example, we need to, or they have like a replacement heart valve, we need to prophylactically give them antibiotics before we do dental work, because the bacteria in the mouth will go through the gums and has basically an affinity for the heart and can reinfect heart complications. Like, so there's this question of like, is there direct causation, poor oral health, on the heart
Right.
with Alzheimer's disease? There's been a lot of like evidence that says there's potential causation there. I it's hard to tease out causation versus correlation here.
Yeah.
I tend to think the mouth is the way I think of it is like the window to your health. Like if things are going wrong in your mouth, it's probably a good sign that that's like a leading indicator that things are going to be happening wrong elsewhere. And I'm not saying it's because the oral health is bad. I'm thinking it's because that what you're putting into your mouth is also causing damage downstream.
So it can be an indicator that there's going to be a problem because of what you're doing, but it may not be like the source of the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
But then but that doesn't mean not to take precautions and to use that marker and say, look, my teeth are jacked. I need to look at what I'm doing.
Exactly, 100%. And that's so an interesting thing to think about is like, we know sugar causes this dysbiosis in the mouth. So we're talking about the microbiome, like sugar causes the dysbiosis where the pathogenic bacteria become predominant and you get decay. Is it that crazy to think that sugar downstream might cause dysbiosis of the gut?
Other problems too.
Like to me, that's like, that should actually be the assumed until proven otherwise.
Yeah.
But a lot of people think like sugar, like, oh, it's bad for your teeth, but like, yeah, it's fine downstream. I'm like, whoa, I think you should almost assume like we know it's bad for your teeth. Yes. We should probably assume until proven otherwise that maybe this has adverse downstream effects.
Yeah. Does the chewing effect, this just randomly popped in my head, is there more of a wear and tear on your teeth and enamel by chewing plants versus chewing meat?
For sure.
How does that work?
So there's an interesting book. I have it behind me. It's dental archaeology book. But basically, by looking at wear patterns on teeth, we can infer what humans as well as other animals eat. We can infer their diet based on how, when teeth bite on a plant, there are certain fibers and things that will cause certain micro wear in teeth. And so, yeah, certain things will wear down teeth more than others. Like if you're chewing on bones, that's going to cause more wear than chewing on flesh. And we can infer a certain amount. There certain things, it's like that causes wear, this causes wear. So, I'm going to say, so it's a group of Native Americans and maybe in Canada. Anyways, the sand would get on their meat. And so they would eat it and it would be filled with sand. Their teeth, they had horrible wear, but they didn't have decay. Like they had good oral health, but they had heavy tooth wear. And a lot of it's from the sand that would get on the meat that they would hang out to dry.
Gotcha. Okay. Man, this is fascinating. Okay. So let's get into, I think we covered a lot of the teeth stuff. Let's talk about the plaque and the calculus and where that's from. Because I know me personally, it's something that I've dealt with I've been carnivore for 4 years, a little over 4 years now. I've talked to other people in this space. It's not something I hear a lot of people talk about, but I feel it's one of those things like if I polled a bunch of people and they were honest, I think more people than not would say, yes, I feel like being carnivore, I've had more of a plaque buildup than I would have expected.
Yep.
So what is that all about?
So there's a great question. And it's one I've gotten for so long. Yeah. And I put it off. I shot a video literally yesterday. I'll post it tomorrow. It goes through it. Whenever I shoot a video, I'm like, I don't want to leave anything out because then it's hard to go edit. But anyways, I just shot the video. There's a few things. One, like we talked about earlier, we see through the archaeological record, by all observation, great oral health with dental calculus, meaning maybe not pathogenic. I could even make an argument for it being a protective mechanism.
See, that's what I've kind of thought. But go ahead.
Yeah, quick story. When I was in dental school, this is not taught in dental school, but I had a patient. He was in his 60s, first time being to the dentist. He came in, I look in there, and she just got tons of calculus. And calculus is the hard stuff. We'll define plaque and calculus, but it's the hard stuff. And I was like, oh man, I mean, hours of scraping and cleaning. I finally got it all off. And, we do an assessment. There's no decay under it. There's no periodontal disease. I'm like, man, this guy just had tons of calculus.
Right.
His teeth are totally fine. But we do know as well, like if you have lots of calculus and a bad diet, it can actually lead to like periodontal disease. So I don't tell people, I'd be very cautious to be like, calculus is good. Because it depends. It's just like we're talking about. Bacteria in your mouth are important, but you can have bad bacterial balances and like a good, healthy bacterial balance. So just a quick backstory so we could like give the decent information for listeners.
Yeah.
If we have a tooth, a pellicle forms on the tooth like within seconds of like if you brush your tooth. The pellicle is like this protein film. And then glycoproteins from the saliva will attach onto that, bacteria will attach onto that. And that is, so you have a biofilm of bacteria on the teeth. This is normal, natural. It happens in humans, it happens in animals. So it's not like a bad thing. That's plaque. When calcium and phosphate from saliva mineralize that plaque, turn it hard, then we call it dental calculus, sometimes referred to as tartar. And I believe personally that can be totally not bad, even protective, but I also think it could be bad depending on the other factors.
Right.
And so a lot of people ask like, oh, why I went carnivore? Why am I having like more calculus buildup? And it could be from a number of reasons. One, the most common I see is transitioning. So transition to carnivore, you go through this big fluid mineral rebalancing. A lot of times you can have some short-term dry mouth, and these things can lead to increased mineral deposits in your plaque, turning into calculus. Very common story, like you mentioned, like people 6 months in, they have lots of calculus, more buildup. 6 months later, back to normal or better than normal. Worth mentioning, anecdotally, I have heard probably maybe equal amounts, like I have less dental calculus or no dental calculus, it improved. Other half say I have more, it gotten bigger.
Yeah,
so it's not like
here.
a universal expectation.
Yep.
It would be more interesting if it was like a universal thing that happened. But yes, very variable experiences. A few things that can like make it worse, or anecdotally that I've seen improve calculus or get less calculus, is one is dairy. When people remove dairy, they tend to see improvement, like less dental calculus. Okay. I have not experienced that. I've taken dairy in and out, and I haven't seen any change. Coffee is another one. Coffee has tannins in it, and tannins are basically, they bind protein. And long story short, that can lead to
kind of make everything come together. Yeah,
that can lead to more calculus buildup. So coffee,
well, that explains my problem.
Coffee, dairy. I mean, you could try taking it out. You could try taking, see if it changes things.
Right.
But let me see. There's a few other things that I should have a list here in front of me.
Yeah.
An interesting aside would be looking at their diet, because there's studies done in animals and carnivores, lions and tigers. They fed a subset ground beef, and the other one had their full animal, like eating a carnivore. The ones that were fed ground beef had increase in calculus buildup, and it's because it's less chewing mechanical forces that would basically get the plaque off the teeth, if you think about it that way.
Yeah. Okay.
And so if someone's just eating ground beef and eggs, they would be, in my opinion, have a higher proclivity of having dental calculus versus someone that's eating like raw steaks.
Interesting. Okay. That's crazy.
Yeah. So if it's adaptation, it could be the foods, it could be the type of foods, it could be totally normal, non-pathogenic.
Okay.
Let me just pull up
when I did a Google a few weeks ago trying to get ready for our talk, just looking at some of this stuff, one of the things that I found, there were a couple articles mentioning vitamin C and how vitamin C can have a role.
You brought up an interesting thing. So vitamin C is related to oxalates as well.
Okay.
And so there's a theory that I could tell you I'm very skeptical of, that oxalates and oxalate dumping oxalates bind calcium, and that binding could then be deposited on the tooth, lead to increased calculus from oxalate dumping. I am skeptical of that, but I'm open-minded that that's potentially contributing to some calculus buildup.
Yeah.
What's an interesting aside is pyrophosphate is a molecule naturally in saliva, but they put it into anti-tartar toothpaste, and it binds calcium. And these things that bind calcium can help prevent calculus buildup because it binds the calcium instead of the plaque binding the calcium.
Interesting.
So
okay.
Oxalates I'm skeptical of. One thing that I think may be worth trying is your carnivore diet. Is it what's like your macros?
Right now I'm doing about 200 grams of protein and 160 grams of fat.
Okay, so it's pretty high protein relatively. I'm the same way. Now there's interesting research that showed high protein diets can increase calcium or calculus, as well as high carbohydrates diet can increase calculus, which to me,
Interesting.
when I read that these two different studies, it signaled to me is like, maybe we should just like eat more fat, try decreasing
Yeah,
carbs and or protein to see if that
sure.
happens. I think there's an interesting potential there.
Yeah, so this it's interesting you say that because while my protein is pretty much always
Yeah,
higher than
me
the
too.
average, I have recently increased my fat a little bit because I started doing BJJ 3 times a week. Like my intensity of exercise and activity has significantly increased, so I upped my fat a little bit. Um, at the same time, and now unfortunately I wasn't doing this specifically with my teeth in mind, but I did go through about a week of self-cleaning, trying to get rid of whatever I had, and then making sure that I religiously brush my teeth to try to keep it off and see how things go. And I feel like since I've upped my fat, I've had less of a battle to keep it away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I don't know if that, I mean, totally anecdotal, no idea if there's a relation or
I would
not,
love to
but
hear more like anecdotal things from people
yeah.
because my protein's always been very high.
Mm-hmm.
Like 2 grams per pound of body weight
Yeah.
is not weird. Like that's actually almost normal.
Mm-hmm.
But I've lowered it recently to probably like 1.5, 1.2 grams per pound of protein
Yep.
and increase the fat. And one of the reasons I was doing is I'm curious in this correlation. I get mild calculus buildup, but nothing bad.
Okay.
And I'm curious if I can. I want more data.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
Yeah.
but
So
that's
if
I found that
anybody's
interesting in the
listening,
research.
if anybody's listening, I'd love to hear feedback. Are you a higher protein, higher fat, mostly ground beef, mostly steak? Like where are you at, and
Yeah,
what do your teeth
exactly.
look like? You know?
Exactly. So there are a lot of these factors that could play a role. The last thing I'll mention on it that tends to play a role, and it's not necessarily switching to carnivore, but dry mouth can precipitate increases in calculus, and so there's a whole host of things that increase dry mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, every prescription medication will increase dry mouth. Like if you read prescriptions, it'll say like the side effects: xerostomia. Xerostomia is dry mouth,
Okay.
and so that can precipitate it. Chronic stress can precipitate it because you activate your sympathetic nervous system is always kind of constantly activated, and parasympathetic is the rest and digest.
Right.
Part of the rest and digest is salivary flow, and so if you have impeded salivary flow, that you can have increase in dental calculus. So
Gotcha.
there's just a few things: mouth breathing, like someone's breathing through their
When
mouth
I'm
at night.
asleep, that happens. I
Yeah.
wake up at night sometimes, and I'm just like, like what the hell?
So that's it. That's a good segue into sleep.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Exactly. So let's talk about sleep apnea. And I think so many people that I've worked with in the past and currently have it or are dealing with it. A lot of it is is an additional symptom to insulin resistance, obesity, and a bunch of other things. But there's definitely some other things that I know that people, even though after they lose weight, they get healthy, they fix their insulin resistance or whatever else, they still have to deal with it. So I guess we should start with, well, what is sleep apnea, and then what are the things that cause it, and if your health journey isn't fixing it, what are your other options?
Absolutely. And I love this topic because it kind of ties in everything: nutrition,
Mm-hmm.
oral health, and then sleep. So 2 seconds of backstory. I was in dental school. I figured out like I didn't want to drill and fill for 40 years, 40 hours a week. Like I felt like I came on this dental sleep medicine and I saw a gigantic problem with sleep apnea. Dentists have this novel solution, and I just went deep into the sleep rabbit hole. And I started a practice where all I did was treat obstructive sleep apnea with these oral appliances. And so that was my segue into sleep apnea. Now, what it is when you go to sleep, you should breathe through your airway,
Mm-hmm.
and that airway will collapse. And if it fully collapses, that's called apnea. There's also a term called hypopnea, which is like a partial collapse,
Mm-hmm.
but it collapses enough where it causes a 4% drop in your oxygen saturation. So it's like you're not breathing adequately. It's causing your oxygen to drop.
Okay.
And so the way people are traditionally scored is how many apneas and hypopneas do you have per hour? And so 15 or less, you're mild. 15 to 30, you're moderate. 30 and above, severe sleep apnea. So if you think about that, someone with severe sleep apnea, at least 30 times every hour, they are not breathing, or
wow.
it's so thin. It's like the airway is so small that their oxygen is is significantly dropping.
Wow.
And what happens with people with apnea is the body doesn't want to die in its sleep. And so the autonomic nervous system, that's the part that like you don't have to control your heart beating,
Yep.
the autonomic nervous system will kick in and say, look, the oxygen in the blood is dropping. We need to basically open up the airway. And so it'll stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, pump adrenaline, norepinephrine. Unconsciously, often the body will wake itself up to a lighter area of sleep where you'll get increased muscle tone, both like in your tongue, open up the airway, and then you relax again. It all collapses down again, and then it does that all night long. So people with sleep apnea, they don't ever get a good night's sleep ever,
Right.
and people traditionally go 5 to 10 years before they get a diagnosis. So that they could be a decade on average of not sleeping.
They're freaking
exactly
zombies, right?
Walking zombies. Like to me, that's just absolutely catastrophic. Everything from like cardiovascular health, mental health, it is associated with pretty much every bad outcome that we talk about today.
Wow.
So that's the gist of what sleep apnea is. The way dentists treat it is people that have ever been taught CPR, you're told to like lift the jaw to open up the airway. Well, we create these custom appliances that we position the jaw in a position that helps maximize the opening of the airway and prevents the jaw from falling back. Okay. And they're moderately effective. And they tend to decrease AHI, the apnea-hypopnea index, the severity by 50%. So some people that with mild apnea, you give them an oral appliance, they're great. Some people with severe sleep apnea, give them an oral appliance, it helps, but maybe not cure it. And I don't know if we want to go down this rabbit hole, but that's where I developed what's now called the NED device, nasal EPAP dilator. It's this device that goes in your nose. Originally, I developed this device for my patients to use in combination with their oral device. So I was like, man, if I can use this device and this device, I could treat all apnea severities. Because that was the frustration I was feeling in the practice where I'd see a lot of severe sleep apnea patients. And I'd make the oral device. We'd get them from like a 40 AHI to like a 15. But at 15, I'm like, 15 times an hour, you're still
a lot. That's
that's still, that to me, that is not good enough.
Wow.
So I made this device called the NED device, and it's not yet FDA approved for apnea for listeners, but right now we use it just for snoring, because snoring is basically the airway is collapsing, but not to such a degree that you're not breathing.
Okay.
So
interesting. I've heard that. I've heard snoring isn't like, it's a sign that there's things that need to be worked on or looked at or whatever. So total segue, off topic. How do you fix snoring?
So snoring is the airway decreasing, and the way the device, there's several things you can do about it. The device that I developed, it uses a technology known as EPAP, which is expiratory positive air pressure. And we could talk about CPAP, which is continuous positive air pressure. That's like the traditional treatment for sleep apnea, where you have this hose connected to a mask. It's pumping air through your airway, as like basically it's a pneumatic splinting of the airway to keep the airway open. Sounds crazy. It is crazy, but that's what people use for sleep apnea. Yeah. So the EPAP is where you breathe out your nose, and it provides a slight resistance to that exhalation. It creates a back pressure that basically will help prevent the airway from collapsing. It's kind of a complicated mechanism that is not even 100% fully understood, because there's some, like, you keep a higher residual capacity of air in your lungs, a lot of different stuff that goes into this that prevents the airway from collapsing. But so there's, long story short, the NED device uses EPAP. There's other things like CPAP, AutoPAP. AutoPAP is like, it's basically a CPAP machine that will auto titrate the pressure going through your nose. We might be getting too technical, or
I'm sure. Well, there are probably people that have some or all of these, right?
People that have sleep apnea, they know CPAP, they know AutoPAP. They may not know EPAP, because EPAP is like the unknown technology, I should say. Cool. You use your own breath to keep your airway open, and so to me, it's a much more less invasive, more kind of
more
holistic.
Natural kind of holistic. Okay, so what causes sleep apnea? Right, from what my very little knowledge, right, the biggest thing that I hear causes it is being obese, insulin resistance, being metabolically unhealthy. Is that literally what it is, or is it more complicated than that?
I think there's two main things. One is this term I'm working on coining called fatty tongue.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So we have,
I love new terms.
That's not yet a scientific term, but it's similar. Like the analogy I like to use is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Mm-hmm.
So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, they started using that term, I think in the 80s, pretty recent like medical diagnosis. And now 25% of US adults have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, like some crazy amount. And I think it's important because to me, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is basically a way of saying you have metabolic dysfunction, right? You're obese. And fatty tongue is very much a similar thing. It's like your body is depositing fat wherever it can. And so we see in obesity that there will be excess fat stored in the tongue. And we have a mouth that has a limited space.
Right.
And that's the other thing I'll talk about here in a second. But you start putting a fat tongue in there, the tongue only has one way to go, and that's backwards in the throat. So you go to sleep, you're laying on your back, that tongue falls back in your throat, you get obstructive sleep apnea. Right. So most people with sleep apnea, when they sleep supine, that's on their back, the apnea is worse. Mm-hmm. Sleep on your side, it tends to improve. That's called positional therapy, where you actually train someone to sleep on their side to improve the sleep apnea.
Right.
Now, I should say perhaps the primary cause, but although we could probably consider both of these primary causes, is our mouths are too small. And this goes back to what we were talking about. When we don't have adequate development of the maxilla and the mandible, we get these narrow dental arches, we get malocclusion, teeth crowding. So we then have a smaller space for our tongue. That's a healthy tongue. So people that are not overweight or obese, they could still have too small of a mouth for their tongue, and that tongue could still fall backwards and obstruct the airway.
Wow. So
that definitely plays a role. What else plays a role? As we age, we lose muscle tone. And so that muscle tone is what we need to keep the airway open while we sleep. So these are those two are, to me, are like primary causes. Inadequate development of the face. So our mouth is too small and our tongue basically is in too small of an environment, has one place to go, backwards, falls in the back of the throat. The other thing is obesity, and we get these big necks, we get big fat tongue, the airway is just way smaller. Right. And so that obstructs the airway there. And we combine that with the loss of muscle tone and REM sleep, which is the rapid eye movement sleep, where you lose basically all muscle tone besides the diaphragm in your eyes. Yeah. That combination gives you sleep apnea.
Gotcha. Okay. So you just mentioned REM sleep, and that kind of, you keep going right into the next area. Like, we didn't coordinate this, everybody's wondering. I wanted to talk about sleep quality and help people understand it's not something I think, well, I've heard a lot of stuff, and I think depending on where you go, there's a bunch of information. But in your experience, how does someone know if they got a good night's sleep? Like, I know for myself, I wear a smartwatch. I like to look at my sleep, and I see, I got 45 minutes of this and an hour and a half of this, and I got 20 minutes of deep sleep. I'm like, why can I never get over 20 minutes? And my rating is I got a 90% of sleep tonight. I don't know what that means. How do you know if you've gotten a good night's sleep?
Sure. So there's objective and subjective measurements.
Okay.
And so, objective is great. You do like a PSG, polysomnograph. That's like someone goes in for a sleep study. They can do these at home too. So you can do home sleep test, right, where they're tracking brain waves, they're tracking your pulse ox. And so, for example, you see your oxygen drops below 90% saturation. That's like red flag. That oxygen should always be above 90% saturated.
Okay.
The blood should always be over 90% saturated with oxygen. So you have like objective measures like that you can be like, we can look at a test and be like, did you have a good night's sleep?
Yeah.
Or did you have an AHI of 42 and you have severe sleep apnea? So you have those objective measures, as well as like the sleep trackers, like you mentioned, and they are getting better. Early on, I would say, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, I would have been like, said it's closer to just throwing darts in the dark.
Right.
But they have gotten better. So I'm not fully sold on like I'm not fully sold that we're quite there yet, where it's like, let me look at my watch to see if I had a good night's sleep last night. I actually think a lot of times that can be bad, where the watch said you had a bad night's sleep. So then you have this mindset where, I should be tired today. I didn't sleep good last night.
Yeah,
I'm like,
totally.
I'm almost like,
absolutely. Yeah.
Look at that data. But then you have the subjective test, which is like how you feel. And so there's something known as the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, something I give to patients where they just basically rate themselves how likely they'll fall asleep in various situations.
Oh, okay.
And it's an assessment of daytime sleepiness. So that's kind of the primary way of assessing a good night's sleep is like, are you falling asleep in the middle of the afternoon or all day? Like, are you
Right.
dozing off while you watch TV? Are you dozing off while you do a podcast? Like, that's not a good sign. So it's like, how easily would you fall asleep in certain circumstances?
Okay.
So you get that subjective measures. If we tie this into carnivore, very common thing is people might sleep an hour less than their usual, and they wake up without an alarm, energetic, energy throughout the day. They go to sleep the next night, they fall asleep in 10 seconds. By all means, like, all these metrics are like, that's great, right? So the amount of hours of sleep we need varies from person to person. 7 to 8 hours is a good general guideline. But there are various things that can influence that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. No, it's interesting because the more people I talk to and the longer I do this, the more I'm starting to realize that I've always looked at carnivore and carb reduction and being fat adapted and all these things as a metabolic process. And I just had a really interesting interview that I did with Dr. Saibas last week. And he introduced the concept of the central governor theory, reflex, which is really that it's not about your metabolism at all. It's not about your muscles and fuel utilization. It's not about your cardiovascular system. It is literally the brain's adaptation and your liver's adaptation and the brain-liver connection. And that when our brain is adapted and ketogenic, then the rest of the body follows suit. And it's really bringing a lot of things together, because when we talk about brain health, we talk about central nervous system and how ketones and being ketogenic started as a therapeutic thing in the modern times, right?
Right.
And has gotten into where we're now realizing that, the benefits of dementia, Alzheimer's, multiple sclerosis, brain injury, all these things. But it's now translating into, wait a second, we thought that physical activity was limited by our fuel stores in our muscles, our fuel stores in our body, when really and this is something that's new that he introduced, is that it's really how well your brain is adapted. If your brain's not adapted to utilize ketones, it shuts the rest of the body down, regardless of the amount of fuel that's available.
Interesting.
So now what you're talking about from a sleep perspective, someone who's carnivore, low carb, their brain is now functioning more efficiently, so it needs less rest, right? I talk about recovery all the time. As I've been carnivore, my recovery time has decreased. I don't need to take as much of a rest. And so what you're saying correlates to that same kind of concept. If your brain is functioning better, more efficiently, it doesn't need as much rest.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. There's the big difference between sleep duration, like time in bed, and sleep efficiency.
Right.
So someone with sleep apnea, a lot of times they want to spend all day in bed, all night and all day.
Yeah.
It's because they're not like their sleep efficiency, it's terrible. Whereas someone is like, their head hits the pillow, they're asleep, then they wake up 7 hours later and they went through the REM, they went through the delta, they went through all the sleep cycles as they should, and they feel great. Like, yeah, by all means, like those, one person stayed in bed a lot longer than the other, but one had a lot better night's sleep.
A lot better night's sleep. Yeah, for sure. And I know for me, so I deal with a lot of people who have different areas of things that they're working on. Most people need help with their sleep.
Yeah.
And there's so many different ways. I don't know if you're familiar with Huberman Labs. And that stuff. So he came out with a video recently that talked about like 8 different ways on things you can do to improve your sleep. So if anybody's interested, I think that's a great video to watch, Huberman Labs on his podcast on YouTube. But for me, I know I've tried to, we have a blackout curtain. We have no lights. We try to drop the temperature of the apartment before we go to bed. But the biggest thing for me is I started dosing like 350 milligrams of magnesium every night. And that was the biggest change. Like I freaking knock out. And then I'm done. I get up in the morning. I'm like, let's go.
What kind of magnesium?
Glycinate.
Glycinate. Yeah. That's a common thing that I hear from people, for sure.
Cool. All right. So the last thing I want to ask you before we go, I think from a practical perspective for people is, what is the best way to take care of your oral health, and what things should you avoid?
Okay. This is great because I if we think about what would be the best diet for your mouth.
I wonder.
All right. So I'll tell you, it would be a diet that, and we can figure out how to formulate this diet, but it would be a diet that requires a good amount of chewing.
Yep.
Has a good amount of fat soluble vitamins. It requires infrequent meals. More frequent is worse for oral health. So
Mm.
infrequent meals, lots of chewing, and a lack of carbohydrates.
Okay.
Like that is how. So that's how we could back ourselves into like ideal oral health.
Right.
Infrequent meals, lots of chewing, no carbohydrate.
So here's a matrix you can make, because I know this is right up your alley. You're a graphics guy.
I am.
What you just said with nutrient density, bioavailability, and satiety. If we combine those three together, I think it points a really clear arrow at certain food types. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. Like I always like to do like think inversion of things to solve problems. So like what's the worst thing you could do for your oral health? And it would be eat constantly, lots of carbs, and make those foods real soft, even better, even worse, make them liquid. So just lots of liquid sugar all day long. That's the worst thing you can do for your oral health. So a lot of the decay that with the pediatric patients I see, they drink lots of sugar drinks. That's like part of it. And that's why they have all the decay that they do.
Right.
So that's the worst diet. So then you can just flip that on its head. Okay, what would be the opposite of that? Infrequent meals, no carbs, lots of chewing. People didn't figure it out. That means lots of meat.
Yeah. Okay. Now, what about like just the normal traditional care? Like, is there a specific toothbrush or what to stay away from? I know charcoal toothpaste is something that a lot of people are going to, trying to get away from all this other chemical stuff or whatever. I don't know.
Stay away from that personally.
Yeah.
So this is where we get quote unquote personalized medicine, because it's very much going to depend on someone's diet. For someone that's eating more of a standard American diet, I tend to give them more standard American advice when it comes to oral health. Meaning like, look, you're eating a standard American diet, then if you want to try and prevent decay, like I'm not a fan of fluoride. However, topical fluoride in a toothpaste will help prevent decay. So that's not to say I'm an advocate of fluoride. I'm not.
Sure.
Especially in kids, it's been shown to decrease IQ quite reliably. Like to me, that's just frightening. And in adults, it's not good. Can interfere with your thyroid because it competes with iodine. So like, I'm not a fan of fluoride. I filter it out of my water. But if someone's eating a standard American diet, it could help prevent decay in your toothpaste. So that's where I like my recommendations vary based on what are you eating? What's your diet like? If we're doing the best diet like we just talked about for oral health, like technically you don't even need to brush your teeth. You don't need to do anything. Like you don't. But if you want to, it feels like a very unsatisfying answer. So I could say that kind of like what I do, like I do recommend an electric toothbrush for people. That takes a lot of the user air out of it, because you're not going to brush too hard. So you're not going to worry about having hard bristles, brushing too hard, causing recession. So electric toothbrush, they're relatively cheap these days. Pretty good job. When it comes to what to put on it, how often, to me, it really does depend on what you're eating. If you're eating a good diet, you can just electric toothbrush with water. If you want to get rid of some of the plaque, there's different kinds of toothpaste, but I don't really recommend any of them as like the go-to.
Sure.
Because they tend to all have cons in various ways. One of the safest bets is like baking soda is pretty like, if you're gonna make a mouthwash,
old school old
school.
Yeah.
And so there's a toothpaste called Revitin, which is pretty much like you're putting it on your toothbrush just so you have the feel of toothpaste, but not really doing much. But some people want like the whitening, so then you're gonna need like a form of peroxide in it. So it's a terrible answer to that. Depends on what one's goal is. I like to recommend like the ideal: eat the great diet, and then if you want to brush your teeth, use like an electric toothbrush and water. That's all you need. And if you want some whitening or some extra enamel protection, if it has fluoride topically and you spit it out and you don't swallow it, it's not the worst thing in the world, although it's not great.
Sure.
Peroxide kind of has a similar thing where topically spit it out once or twice a day, probably not a big deal.
Okay. Man, that's awesome. So, God, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that going to help people out here. Let's just go with this, because I feel like I've got a couple of the questions, but they're not quite formed. So we'll have to save it for part 2 at some point in time. Where can people find you, and what's the best way for people to get your information and see what you got?
Yeah, I apologize. I'm kind of all over the place. But it's interesting. This stuff all ties together from different areas. Like we talk
Yeah.
about sleep and it ties in with diet, ties in with bodybuilding, oral health. So, it's all together. The best place to get information would be meet.health. That's a website I run.
Yep.
There's 30-day guides in there, bunch of free guides, the plant ebook. So people that are like carnivore, that's where I would go. The sleep device, that's ned.rest, ned.rest. And then I have my own blog, I guess you call it, kevinstock.io. But I just recommend people, like, if you curious about this stuff, just I have a newsletter called the Saturday 7 that I send out just Saturday, 7 a.m., 7 things, 7-minute read. And that's where I try and just put the best of everything. So if you don't want to go anywhere else.
Gotcha. Cool. All right. Appreciate it. Thanks for being on, man. I appreciate it. I know we met at KetoCon this year. I'm assuming are you going to go again next year?
I mean, I would love to. I haven't.
Okay.
I've neither confirmed nor denied.
So it's in April this year, so it's earlier, but it's looking like it's going to be pretty big. I know we're planning on going, so hopefully we can see you there. And if not, definitely keep in touch, and we'll have you on here again, man. Thanks a lot.